Hello, and welcome to our Patch Tuesday webinar. Today, we have industry expert Rob Brown to give us an inside look at the latest Patch Tuesday release. If you have any questions, please add those to the chat and the team will reach out after to answer them. With that, I'll pass it over to Rob.
Thank you, Kristen. We appreciate that. And very warm welcome to everybody joining us today for the February Patch Tuesday. It's obviously my favorite month of the year. We have the the Six Nations rugby tournament running for the entirety of February, and it's very exciting for me. Anyway, about Patch Tuesday, we have some interesting news today about the Microsoft Patch Tuesday for this month, considering we had the largest Patch Tuesday for the year last month. So we're going to get straight in, starting with the Windows life cycle. Now, I'm going to keep talking about this. I had a lot of emails from a lot of viewers. By the way, thank you for sending those questions in. I really appreciate helping as many as I can, keeping the Windows feature update up to date and why it's important to do that. Now, specifically, the Windows feature update sits on the operating system and patches fit on to the feature update. So once your feature update goes end of life, you are no longer able to keep those devices patched. And the issue with that is that certain antivirus products require an active feature update. So when the feature update goes out of date, sometimes the antivirus can too. It's very, very important. But more importantly, when we have obsolete operating systems, that's a whole new challenge as a replacement of an operating system for another. Now, Windows 10 Enterprise is going end of life in October of this year. There is not a lot of time left. And actually, a lot of questions from the viewers over the last couple of months has been how to do the migration and are we able to help? If you are stuck, please do get in contact with your customer success team. Here at Absolute, we will direct you to our teams that are able to assist you to enable you to create a Windows 10 to Windows 11 migration task, effectively rebuilding the operating system, allowing you to work on the latest operating system from Microsoft. Now, some of the hardware requirements don't support Windows 11, so it's important that you know whether or not that project is viable based on your hardware. We also have Windows Server 2012. Windows Server 2012 did go end of life, but there is this special extension license called an ESU license that is in year 2 right now, and year 3 will mean that in October of next year, that operating system will be fully end of life. Windows 11 22H2, which is the feature update 23H2 is now available. 24H2 is actually now available as well. 22 specifically goes obsolete in October of this year. And if you are on 23H2, you don't have to really worry about going to the next one. You have all the way till 2026. Now, all of that's to say that this doesn't include any long-term servicing branches. In fact, if you are, or if you did use up the Windows 10 or Windows 11 long-term servicing branch, you potentially have until 2030 before you have to worry about replacing the operating system. Do mark these in your calendars, please. If you made a New Year's resolution, as I said last month, do make sure that you plan for these. Some organizations, several 100,000 across multiple geolocations may find the migration a little bit challenging simply with devices and users working at home. But there is technology, there is a plan available. Just give your customer success team a call and we'll try our very best to give you as much guidance as possible, the best way to do that. For the first time in probably 12 months, we had an emergency update for Apple. Now, this actually is specific to the iPhone. I don't usually talk about Apple updates, but this one, because it was released through the Caesar announcement, they mentioned that there is a potential sophisticated attack taking place. So this is a vulnerability that is being actively exploited or what we call weaponized. Now, it impacts iPad and mobile phones. Basically, an authorization issue was addressed in this update with improved state management. A physical attack may disable a USB, maybe disable USB restricted mode on a locked device. So if you have one of these mobile devices and you could access one of these USB-C type of devices, it is potentially able to transfer data to or from those mobile devices. And I think that executives are very often using mobile devices in addition to a laptop or a desktop, simply because of its movability. So if you are supporting the iPad um, devices, please consider to apply these updates as soon as possible, especially considering Apple has made this announcement saying that there is attacks taking place. They are calling it extremely sophisticated, which probably means that it might be a bit challenging, might be a bit difficult to exploit. However, I wouldn't want to be an IT manager that took that chance. So please go ahead and apply those Apple updates to your devices as best you can. Now, for Microsoft, we had we had less than half the updates that we had last month. 2 critical, 51 important, 53 in total. 9 were more likely to be weaponized, which is really interesting. I like to take the data from last month and previous months, and I like to compare for analysis. Where is Microsoft going? How serious is this release compared to other releases? And what can I learn about what is going through the minds of hackers? There were 11 more likely to be weaponized in the last release, even though there were twice as many fixes. 2 in this release are weaponized, 2 are public aware. They are not the same, which is good. So we'll talk about weaponized and public aware in a second, but there are 2 specifically weaponized and 2 specifically public aware. And only 1 had a jump point. Now, there are a lot of messages about jump points. Now, we are following the CVSS severity, and inside the CVSS severity there is a calculator, and that calculator can calculate how the vulnerability can be exploited, whether it requires end users assistance, maybe it's a mistake, maybe it's highly sophisticated, maybe it can be exploited over the internet. One of the questions is something called a scope. And a scope means that you can effectively jump beyond the technology or the vulnerability area into another part of the operating system. So an example could be if you had a vulnerability in a hypervisor and you affected the guest, you could jump to the host or vice versa. So a jump point is very, very serious because it allows you to land through one point of exploit and move sideways within the organization. And we've seen several exploits over the last several years that are actually using one particular exploit to land and then to move sideways inside the organization. Now, the jump point actually can impact any severity of vulnerability. In fact, some vulnerabilities that are marked as 0-day do have a jump point, and some vulnerabilities that are not 0-day do have a jump point. Unfortunately, the scope is not enough to trigger that high severity rating, and some customers are not deploying those updates because they're medium or low severity marked from Microsoft. So as part of the strategy we are using, especially around the education of the strategy that you should be using, we're trying to add these elements into your process so that if you are deciding to choose certain patches over other patches, maybe the scope or the jump point should be part of your decision-making process. We also have the bug type. Now, the bug type, depending on the bug type, is from serious to less serious. In fact, we had 21 remote code execution vulnerabilities, and these are the most serious. Now, it is interesting that remote code execution vulnerabilities don't always get the highest risk. However, remote code execution vulnerabilities are very risky because they're a class of cyber attack. So often, the RCE vulnerability, as it's also known, is used in remote attacking of a network or a device to plant malware or malicious code that can then be launching and executing code in your organization to basically spread the attack throughout your organization. It's very, very serious. So we like to consider the bug types in our process when we're choosing what are the most serious vulnerabilities that I want to tackle first. And second, we have elevation of privilege. There are 18 fixes in this release for them. That's a threat actor that gains access to an employee's account, bypasses it, bypasses the authorization channels, and successfully grants themselves access to data they're not supposed to have. Imagine that, granting themselves access to data. So effectively having access to any files that I wish. And denial of service is kind of the third worst serious. That's basically just shutting down a device so it's inaccessible. We had 9 of those. We had 2 security feature bypasses to allow you to use features you're not supposed to have, 1 spoofing vulnerability as an act of disguise, and 1 tampering as well. This month, we didn't have any information disclosure vulnerabilities at all. So what we also like to do is to recommend, if you are a customer of ours, what would we recommend is what we call your patch risk profile. Now, your patch risk profile isn't just the severity of a vulnerability. We actually use the vendor severity as part of that decision-making process. Vendors release their patches from critical, high, or important, medium, low, and NA. It goes from critical, which is the most serious, to NA, which is the least serious. The CVSS score, which I just mentioned, has exactly the same tier for 10, which is the highest severe vulnerability, to 0, which is the least. And effectively, it goes from critical, high, medium, low, and NA. Now, if you combine the two, you have more of a transparent selection of updates that you might want to install because they don't, unfortunately, have a consistent mechanism for staying true to each other. A lot of vulnerabilities that are high on one side are critical on the other, critical on one, low on the other. If you combine the two, then you ensure that you have the highest severity vulnerabilities chosen in that deployment. And we think that's important because if you rely on just one or the other, you may have vulnerabilities that you're not able to remediate. Then we've got the state of the vulnerability. Now, the state of the vulnerability is weaponized, which means it's under active attack, also known as exploited. Public aware, also known as publicly aware, that's where a bug bounty program has published material that shows exactly how to exploit that vulnerability. In fact, lately we found a lot of white hat hackers, as they're known, putting a YouTube channels together to explain exactly in this scenario, under this condition, we are able to exploit a vulnerability. Now, if you've got an exploited vulnerability, if you've got a public aware vulnerability that isn't yet weaponized, but there are steps or the blueprint precisely outlining how you can exploit it, I think that makes that vulnerability pretty serious. Now, not all public aware vulnerabilities become exploited, but it is a good idea to include them in your decision-making process. I certainly won't want to be an IT manager that knew something that wasn't weaponized, but was public aware, 2 weeks later became weaponized, and I was now under active attack. So we can use this as proactive steps to select patches for remediation. Then we've got our balance. Our balance is what we call a countermeasure. Sometimes vulnerabilities have a patch that you can apply, and only a patch will solve the problem. Some vulnerabilities have mitigations or workarounds provided by the vendor, which could be a registry key, could be stopping of a service, it could be you've got the next generation antivirus and it protects you. But those countermeasures can often be used to remediate a vulnerability much faster than the rolling out of a patch. So if you keep an eye on the countermeasure and you have a countermeasure available, perhaps you might want to deploy it. That will mitigate the risk, especially if there is a weaponized vulnerability that has a countermeasure. You can potentially deploy the registry key in minutes, but in your highly distributed environment, it could take days or weeks to roll out. One thing to note, though, golden rule is if you have a countermeasure and you apply it, read the instructions from the vendor. If the vendor recommends to remove the countermeasure after you apply the update, please follow that recommendation. And finally, of course, is your exposure. If you factor all of those together and you combine it with your exposure, any vulnerability which is a high severity, high CVSS, yes, it's weaponized, and or with public aware states with high exposure should be deployed first. Some customers are not able to deploy all the updates at once. That is very true. Now everyone is still working from home, and some of these updates are 1.5 gigabytes in size. In that condition, we're not able to safely deploy everything at once. But what you can do is you can handpick the updates that matter the most. So send them out in group one, and then send out a few days later the next set of updates that hopefully have become smaller and smaller in size. That way you're focusing on the highest risks, covering the highest risks, and then moving to the lesser risks. I never say no risk, the lesser risks, because every vulnerability, even if it has a severity of low, has some risk to your organization. So let's take a look at our recommendation. Now, if you're familiar with this format, we actually put everything up on our website, and it's actually amazing. Our team have done a great job moving everything across to the new Absolute website. So if you pop across to absolute.com, if you're familiar and you've gone to the Syxsense website, like usual, we have everything on the Syxsense website as well. If you come to the resources section, you'll find the Absolute blog. All of our blog posts that we publish regarding strategies, patch testing, Patch Tuesday, of course, go into here. And you just go and click on this. This is actually online on Patch Tuesday evening. And you can actually take a read of that. If you're not an Absolute or Syxsense customer and you would like to know more about how the technology specifically is able to help protect your organization, you can go ahead and request a demo or use the chat function if you have any questions. Now, as I mentioned before, we had quite a smaller release this month. And I get a lot of questions on Patch Tuesday, and the team wants to pay a lot of attention to responding as soon as we can around the components and the number of patches that we are saying is addressed in Patch Tuesday versus what Microsoft is addressing. So just want to clarify. There was actually a lot more vulnerabilities that were released by Microsoft, but some of those technologies, for example, you'll notice Android and iOS, these are applied automatically to the cloud. Also, some of the Azure updates were automatically applied to the cloud. You don't have to worry about deploying updates to secure those particular parts of your organization. It is taken care for you by Microsoft. What you need to pay attention to is the 53, which are available for you to download and deploy using your patch management tool. I also like to look at what was released previously to compare how serious this Patch Tuesday was to the previous one and to the one before that. Now, although the combined score of 398.3, that's taking all the CVSS scores for every vulnerability that was fixed yesterday, which was, I think, about a third of the total from last month. The average was 7.5, which is higher than last month. So although the release in this Patch Tuesday was only a third, the average was higher, which means there's a lot more things we need to pay attention to. And I'm actually going to cover 5 of the vulnerabilities that I think you should really be paying attention to in this release. Starting with CVE 2025-21418. Now, this particular vulnerability is for WinSock privilege escalation, and it impacts something called the Windows Ancillary Function Driver, AFD.sys. If you've seen any previous weaponized updates from Microsoft, you'll be familiar with AFD.sys. It's a core Windows kernel mode driver. So it's literally the operating system that facilitates network communication amongst devices. And actually, it's used pretty much for all network connections in Windows. Now, this particular vulnerability is an elevation of privilege vulnerability, which is the second most serious in the Windows ancillary function driver for WinSock. Now, this flaw allows both local users and authenticated attackers to get system level privileges on your PC, which potentially could lead to a full control over the device. And of course, if you've got full control over the device, you could do anything you'd like. It impacts Windows 10, it impacts Windows 11, it impacts every single server operating system from Windows Server 2008 all the way up to Windows Server 2025. Extremely, extremely serious. My second recommendation is CVE 2025-21391. This one is Windows storage privilege escalation. Again, another privilege escalation. Now, Windows storage actually kind of makes sense. It refers to the technology, the built-in processes around Windows that allow it to manage how data is stored, accessed, organized on a PC. You know, you're familiar with file system. But it also includes things around disk management, storage virtualization, cloud integration, that sort of thing. This particular vulnerability could allow local and authenticated attackers to delete files. Actually, this is really super interesting. They can literally go in and delete files that Windows needs to function in order to, it can delete files that Windows requires to function, leading to an operating system instability. Consider service disruptions if this becomes exploited. I'm afraid this is marked as weaponized. So this is seen by both Microsoft and also their antivirus partners as a weaponized exploited event. Super serious. This also is impacted on all Windows 10 devices, Windows 11 devices, and everything Windows Server 2008 all the way up to Windows Server 2025. It's extremely important, actually. I would highly recommend this one be your second choice. My third one is for Microsoft Service. This is becoming very popular amongst our customer base. The Microsoft Surface devices have obviously their specific hardware. This one is marked as publicly aware or publicly disclosed, CVE 2025-21194. Now, I know that Microsoft is changing how they're going to be deploying these hardware drivers to the Surface devices, potentially even this year. But this particular vulnerability is the hypervisor vulnerability. It's a hypervisor affecting the UEFI base system, which obviously is the hardware. It does require a reboot to become exploited. However, I wouldn't mark this any less as my third choice. My fourth choice is NTLM. Now, this is CVE 2025-21377, an NTLM hash disclosure. If you're not familiar with what NTLM is, if you're used to Windows NT4 back in the day, this is the authentication protocol that's used in Windows to verify credentials and to allow access to both log on to the device and also to have access to network resources. I do hope you're using version 2. If you still have any technology that's still using NTLM version 1, please make sure that you migrate away as best you can, as quickly as you can. This particular vulnerability is a spoofing vulnerability that allows attackers to effectively steal the NTLM version 2 hash. The hash is actually the username and password combination that Windows use to validate that your username and password combination is correct. It's used for authentication, and Because this is publicly disclosed, I think it's extremely serious that you go ahead and deploy this one, especially if you're accessing uh, any kind of network device, any network shares. As it says, it's important. Credential theft is a key tactic in phishing campaigns and lateral movements within the network. Therefore, if you can exploit this user account and have access to your network, and you could start probing within the network, it is possible that you find another device that then you could just simply continue your exploit. And we think that that risk is far too high. My fifth and final choice is HPC PAC remote code execution, which is the most serious. This actually has the highest CVSS rating of this Patch Tuesday release, which is 9.0. Interestingly enough, I mentioned that sometimes your CVSS and vendor severity don't match. In fact, Microsoft has only marked this as important, whereas a CVSS score of 9.0 and above should be critical. Now, the Microsoft HPC stands for high performance computing. Now, this is used in clustering, cluster management, job scheduling around computing workloads in the operating system that's used to share resources that can perform all sorts of functions like simulation, scientific research, etc. Now, I looked into this one because I've not seen anything like this being exploited before. And I wanted to know more about this. So I did some research. I put it into my friendly AI bot and I said, hey, where could this be an issue? And actually it mentioned that the vulnerability could allow an attacker to execute arbitrary code on a targeted system by simply sending a crafted HTTPS request to the head node of the cluster. And I wanted to know more about what HPC is used for. And it said the 5 most common industry verticals that are using HPC today include academic and research institutions for simulating climate models, physics experiments, etc. Aircraft manufacturing are using this for running aerodynamic simulation. Finance and insurance for high frequency trading and risk analysis. Artificial intelligence, of course, as I mentioned, I use that to get this list for machine learning. And entertainment and media, interestingly enough, for rendering, animation, visual effects for both movies and games. So I think this particular vulnerability is probably more widespread across the server operating system than we might think. And I'm assuming that you still are using a lot of servers, both premise and in the cloud. You might want to prioritize this one. Please follow the 5 recommendations. All other recommendations are in the download here. This particular download is a really cool PDF. We're putting it into a PDF now so you can download it and put it to your own tool set. All you have to do is go into that sheet, take the CVE from the sheet in the order that you see it, write down your exposure in your organization against them, and make sure you prioritize the ones that have the highest exposure in that list. It is important to prioritize first, ensure that you have a strategy, and then consider if you need to, using any kind of automation tools you have available. If you're using the absolute Syxsense platform, please go ahead and use queries to make this a lot simpler. But of course, it's most important that if you don't have a tool that has automation, do make sure you are deploying these updates. I'm really hope that this has been useful. I'm looking forward to joining you again in March. And until next time, happy patching. Best of luck.